and different stuff. So yeah, yeah, love, yeah, yeah. It was loved it. It was developmental for me as a kid. Yeah,
I do not regret a moment of it.
no,
It was all very, very good.
all very good. I had a one of one of one of the things that actually prepared me when I ended up in the military was the training I received. I had a mentor. He was a manager at at a store for the produce section, and he had been in the military years ago, but he had spent, I think, about 10 to 15 years in Okinawa, and came away and had studied Shito-ryu and uh, got a second uh, degree black belt there, and then here continued to study and go back and ended up and just would take kids under his wings. And I saw him one time in a park, just kind of running exercise. I said, well, what are you doing? Yeah, come over here, kid. Yeah.
I started my first year at university.
Mm.
I fell into a bunch of old school Chinese.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I mean, truly all first generation Americans now. They were all chefs in local restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
It was a totally different culture. And, I enjoyed it. I had a great time. I learned an awful lot, a lot of respect. And then I, then transitioned from combative to more Tai Chi stuff.
Mm-hmm. More internal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was probably for about 15 years too. So, I've been doing it my whole
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And then from there, I've gotten into combatives.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I've got a variety of friends in special operations.
Special ops, yeah, come on.
Maybe special forces.
Gotcha.
SEAL forces. I've got a friend who's Mike Holder in 6.
Okay.
So, I just where it happened, I don't know, it just,
That's the evolution. That makes
you
sense.
got it, it just happened.
Yeah.
And it's,
Yeah, that stuff does. Yeah.
It's all the same stuff.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, it's
It's about you.
it's about you. It's always the person. It's it. It's about the person. Absolutely.
And it's just something I've always enjoyed.
Yeah, I did too. For me, I think, it was interesting. The philosophy of it is what really intrigued me. After I started doing the physical part, it first looked cool, and I was thinking, oh, that's cool. I like, you can jump up and do that. You could do. Yeah, that's the least important part of it.
But it's how you, whatever it is, it's part of, it's almost part of the initiation to become a member of that community.
Yes.
Is to go through the physical part of it beforehand. So
Yes.
you can say, well, okay, now I can do whatever.
Yeah, it really is. That's the price of admission. But so I appreciate it when you mention that, because I think it's character building, and I would love to see a lot more. I'd like to see programs in schools where they would be able to bring in, as part of the physical education, things like that, everything from yoga to Tai Chi to Kung Fu, whatever. Yeah, be able to bring in that.
I'm not certain that Phi Ed is there, but it certainly could be.
Hmm.
You can use your ice skating, hockey.
That's right.
It doesn't make any difference. It's just some sort of a structured. Anyway, that's my background. Some sort of structured, disciplined way to do something. Follow through for a period of
Yes.
time to
Yes.
learn, the skills of stick-to-itiveness.
It's character building, and you hit it there. And one of the things that doesn't happen in our society, and this is why I think those things are so important, is that we really don't have a rite of passage many times for young men. We really don't have a rite of passage, and young girls get it a little bit, but not necessarily as much. But we really need that for young men to really have a sense of identity and structure.
Back in the 1800s, one of the rites of passage is when you got your first gun.
Hmm?
Now you can fly.
You can hunt.
And now that's just, I agree that culture just, I don't know, it's an interesting question. I've never thought about it. Is that because we don't have rites of passage now? Is that one reason why there's so many almost what we call lost people in the younger generations? Or the ones who are
That is.
are they lost and therefore not seeking out these rites of passage?
Yeah, I think partially that. Part of that is, considering the way the modern life has evolved, people used to be within that 25 to 50 mile range of where they were born initially, but not anymore. You find a lot of people.
Your family's gone away, so you can never relate to what your grandparents did when they were your age. You can't tell you how
Yeah.
you know.
Well, what gets lost is the kind of intergenerational knowledge, that people would have, and it's just boom.
Mostly disappeared.
Yeah.
I just don't know, but I think back, I'll do this, I think back and say, well, it's okay, I'm X number of years old. What was my dad doing when he was that old? What year was that?
Uh-huh.
What was my grandfather doing when he was that old? And say, they compare the two. And I don't see that happening much now.
No, it's not. Well, no, it's not. It's yeah. Well,
There are
kids,
other things.
kids are being raised by electronics, right? Or telephone. It's hilarious to sit in the mall and watch how many people are literally just or a restaurant, with that. There's one of the courses I teach at a community college is a human relations course, and one of the tasks I give the students in that course is to every term is to go out and say hello, just greet 15 people they don't know. Okay, whether the person responds back or not. Okay, but just to learn to say hello, literally, is difficult, and so they want to come into the field where they're going to be in human services of some sort or another, but they're not even used to talking to people. They're like, "Can I text you?" Yeah. Oh, everybody. True.
The exercise I have some of my students do is I'll tell them to go to the mall, watch people's eyes. Those people there are grazing. They're only less than 5% are predators.
Yep.
The ones that are surfing are, there'll be people grazing in the windows as you walk down and so forth. Don't look at them. Look at the people's eyes, and that'll tell you who's who.
Watching them. I teach over at Glendale Community. Okay, Phoenix and Paradise Valley. Okay, yeah. They are good schools, yeah. I really sought that out. I didn't start there. I didn't. My background isn't to be a teacher necessarily. I'm professional, but just kind of happened. The director of the program over there was Dr. Arbery. He was one of my doctoral students when I taught at ASU briefly, and when he got there, he contacted me and said, would you be interested? I said, yeah. I said, I would love, because part of what I was experiencing, I was focusing with graduate students mostly, and there were certain deficits I saw kind of coming up that I said, okay, I need to, we need to connect with people earlier in this process. And so when I got that opportunity, so I like it. So one of the things that has happened over at Glendale is we have literally revamped the behavioral sciences program so that people will leave that program with certifications, and they can walk into a job and have the certifications, everything from mental health first aid to being certified as a trauma specialist, lay person, et cetera, a number of different certifications that employers want that would cost the employer, thousands of dollars to train a person to get that. So so it's a change in the program. So that was part of what drew me there, was to be part of that, that change, so that people would be able to work. Business? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah. That was, yeah. Yeah, that was probably the most surprising for me as well, was just the level of writing, level of ability to read. Critical thinking wasn't there for many people in that respect. And also, another surprise for me is when I was teaching at the graduate and at undergraduate level briefly, I didn't realize how much plagiarism was taking place. And I started like, what? I'm like, you paid all this money to cheat? Oh, unbelievable. No, it isn't. It was like, what is going on with you guys? Why are you doing it? So, yeah. So So I really do a lot of emphasis around that. I do some basic stuff. They don't teach grammar in school anymore, in elementary school. When I was in elementary school, they taught grammar as part of English. Yeah. Yeah, they don't do that. Yeah, they don't. No.
Doesn't work well with texting and social media.
That's what they teach now. And I've gotten a paper where it was literally written almost in text. These abbreviations, literally from a student. And they said, well, this is what I said. This is the way I talk. This is the way I said I can appreciate that, but this isn't the way you're going to be able to pass the class.
Same problem with math skills too.
Yeah.
Skills are
Yeah.
totally different.
Yeah.
I remember, memorizing all the different tables. In
Oh.
second, third grade, whatever. Plus 2 and 4.
Yes.
Plus 5 equals 8. Or 5 times 9, or whatever. I mean, all of those. If you had to pass a test in, I want to say 3 minutes. You had to get all these things done, or you go to the next grade.
They hold you back. Yeah. Yeah. So, is it time for me to start again? Okay. We're right there. Okay. How you doing in Tucson? Okay? All right. Good. Still hear me? Say she's an idiot. I wonder, am I able to? Does that? Okay. All right, well, I'll just go with it. I had some presenter notes. Okay, I would like to pick back up. And I tend to put more stuff in these slides than I really have time to talk about, but I'm going to go through some of this fast. How does trauma get created? Let me put that question to you. How do you believe trauma gets created from your experience working with various populations and individuals? From your experience, what seems to cause trauma? How does it get created? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Power? Adverse force. Just a little bit more. Can you flesh that out? Physically abused? Okay. Gotcha. Neglected? Okay. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so certainly that's one. Someone else? Another? Yeah, go right ahead.
Stress beyond the person's elasticity to cope with it.
Yes. Okay. Chronic stress.
Whatever the stressor may be.
Okay. Whatever it may be. Anyone else? How does trauma get created? Your thoughts, perspective. There isn't a wrong answer to this, so you're not going to get a red star or anything.
Well, I think it's also affected with not being able to have the necessary coping mechanisms that stress is trauma, but I also don't know that I would always see that trauma has a negative effect on someone that
Okay.
we perceive. Like, if they're in a traumatic situation, they must be, this is what they're going through, and I don't think that's always the case.
We got hit by a tsunami. Does everyone have the same reaction? Yeah, you're making a point. Absolutely true. Anyone else? How do you think trauma gets created? From your experience, even working with the population you work with, what kind of?
Maybe when
Okay, they begin to question, does the world make sense for them? And, does what I believe in have value? Okay, let me go a little bit into this. Let me talk to you about types of exposure and understanding trauma. There are some categories here. The first is high intensity, low frequency. This is an episode, right, high intense episode. And this is an example of natural disasters, physical abuse that's intense, sexual abuse, domestic violence, neglect. And for a long time, didn't see neglect as trauma. People didn't recognize that to isolate children or neglect children was traumatic for them in that respect. Witnessing the crime, being a victim of a crime, of course, military action, accident or injuries, severe wrecks. I'll share with you just briefly from my own experience. When I was 15, 16, I was at a summer camp, and I was a teen counselor working with other kids. And at this camp, it started to rain all of a sudden, just cats and dogs, buckets literally sheets of rain coming down, ankle deep. Right? And so I was getting the younger kids out of that, under a tarp, etc. And I got struck by lightning. Okay. And when it struck, I lost, apparently they thought I was dead. I lost my sight, I lost my hearing, I couldn't touch, but I was completely conscious, which was the unique experience of that. I was completely crystal clear. And it took me a moment, but I realized I must have been struck by lightning. Right? I couldn't feel anything, couldn't hear anything. I was completely in this isolation with that. And the first impulse, just briefly for a second, almost a split instant, the speed of thought, was, should I panic? And I thought, well, no, you shouldn't have to panic. You know, I didn't have a particularly strong philosophy in terms of any spiritual tradition, but I always had a personal sense that life has something that's transcendent, that, you know, this physics thing, that energy, you can't lose it, transforms, spirit, that kind of sense. And so I relaxed, and I just, at that moment, and this is the conversation with myself, at that moment I said, well, this must be what it's like to be dead. And it was in that recognition that I had a little bit of sadness, because I thought about the people who are going to grieve because I'm gone. The sadness that maybe my parents are going to feel, my siblings, that. And it was at that moment I let go and I said, okay, from my perspective, I'm thinking, this is an adventure. What next? I want to see what happens. That was kind of the curiosity that was there, very different. It was in that moment, and I don't know how long it was. To me, it seemed like an eternity, but for others, they said, I got struck, it knocked me down on my hands and knees, and that I was in a seizure. My body was seizing at that point. Eventually what happened is I started experiencing these successive kind of popping noises, like something moving through a membrane. And it kept popping, and eventually I started to gradually feel my body, hear, and to see. But that took about 30 minutes for that to occur, according to the people outside with that. Okay. I can tell you this, lightning hurts. Okay, yeah. If you wanted to know, it hurt. Yeah. Just to tell you that, yeah. Yeah, the season, it wasn't fun. With that, pins and needles, all that kind of things. But no worse for it. Burnt my shoe. No, knocked off my shoe. Burnt, I had a hat, hole in the hat, that kind of thing. Knocked off my shoe. Should have been dead. With that, got up and, you know, literally trying to figure, you know, what's wrong with me? I know I have to be hurt. Yes. I'm good. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I always keep an eye up, but I'm good. And that's a good question, because for several months after that, I literally, almost on a subconscious, this was a subconscious level, I would, whenever the weather started getting bad or a little cloudy, I would find that I would start staying indoors. And I didn't notice it. I would find a reason not to be outside. Okay, and it wasn't conscious, right? There'd be something, watching. I even watched TV shows I didn't like. I know I didn't like them. But I was like, let me see what this is about. Maybe there's something in this. I'm not paying attention. Yeah, that kind of thing. But yes, good question, Frankie, because all of a sudden, and we'll talk about that, because what happens with trauma sometimes is that at a subconscious level, our body actually is aware. There's a concept called neuroception, and we'll talk about that. I'll go through this a little bit. And it's our body awareness that is out of our conscious awareness and perception about things. The extreme of this, of course, is if you see little kids who've been traumatized and assaulted by someone who has abused them, and they get in the presence of that person, and they may urinate on themselves, they may defecate, they may have a reaction, and they're not conscious. It's all involuntary with that, right? Body is just responding to them. And the child may not even remember that person or remember the event. They may not be able to recall it. But their body remembers it, recalls it, and it senses that danger. We'll talk a little bit about that. The other category is low intensity, high frequency. This is the environment I mentioned a little bit when you find people in environments. Right, chaotic environments can do that with people. Aggressive environments. They do this on purpose in boot camp to weed people out. Okay, when they're in boot camp, they stress people out. They take you to the breaking point. Inconsistent parenting. We see this frequently sometimes when there's substance abuse or mental health issues in the home with parents. Financial issues as well. Instability in the family, and then financial and emotional issues. And then there's a low intensity, a continuous environmental one. This is caregiving. And for a long time, people didn't recognize that caregivers actually end up being traumatized by the experience of caring for a loved one. Sometimes they get burnt out. In my family, me and my siblings, I'm part of 8. Okay, with that. The 6 of us, we took care of our mother, who in her last 3 years was on dialysis. Right? Very healthy. I couldn't imagine doing that by myself. And there are people who are doing that with parents now, right? A lot of baby boomers whose parents have developed dementia or Alzheimer's or other issues have come, and they're taking care of their parents. And they may be up in themselves 60s, like me. Okay. Up in that. I'm a youngster still, so it's okay. So caregiving is that, but right now there are some great resources for caregivers that didn't exist when we were doing that for our mother. So we were lucky enough to be able to have the resources together to pool and to take that ownership. But not everyone does that. An only child may be stuck doing that, and that could be traumatic. So I asked you, what creates trauma? Traumagenesis. Simply, the environment activates real physical, emotional, psychological change that becomes enduring characteristics in the individual. So for trauma to occur, an individual has to be in an environment, and their response to that trauma determines whether they're going to develop, at least diagnostically, PTSD. Not everyone responds the same to a traumatic event. Right? I could have been diagnosed with PTSD after being struck by lightning if I had responded to it. I had some of the symptoms, but I really wasn't debilitated to the point that I needed to be taken care of. Right? I would avoid going outside, but I was able to keep going to school. I was able to do whatever else I was doing, mostly. One of the ways that this happens, when we talk about traumagenesis, the beginning of trauma, it happens with epigenetics. Are you familiar with that? That's kind of okay. That's the hot term now. Okay, epigenetics. And epi means essentially on top of the genes. Okay. A little bit more about that. Our everyday experiences are we process are called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the impact of experience on your DNA. And what that means essentially is that we know this from studies. There's a gentleman by the name of Kent Thornburg who is a chronic disease researcher out of Portland, Oregon. And he and his fellows did some research, and what they discovered with regard to epigenetics and chronic diseases is that we can pass down to our offspring the kind of problems that we may be suffering from. Everything from predisposition for diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic diseases, etc. Here's the thing that he discovered with epigenetics is that, and I'll share this with you, women are born with their eggs, right, intact. Take me, for example. I'm 62 now. Okay, I'm thinking of my father, my mother. My mother passed away. She was born in 1916. Okay. And my father was born in 1887. And he lived to be 100. He passed away. So with my mother, right, my mother, right, was an egg in her mother, my grandmother, right. My mother who gave birth to me, her eggs nourished me. She was in her grandmother, and her grandmother was born before the 1900s, her mother. So she was nourished by her mother, right? Eggs fully formed. So her eggs were nourished by that. I was nourished. We talk about a 100-year effect that's generational. So what epigenetics says is that whatever stress, whatever nutritional deficits or problems existed with the grandmother, with my grandmother, say she was really distressed, couldn't get food, right? She was in an abusive relationship or things. That stress has an impact on gene expression. What epigenetics is that it doesn't change your DNA. You're born with that. That remains the same. But the expression of that DNA, what turns on certain genes and off certain genes, we know that stress does that, environment. This is how environment is so important. And what we have discovered is that when someone is living in a stressful environment and they give birth, and the men are impacted, men aren't excused from this. They also pass on things through the sperm. But looking at someone who has been stressed out in a stressful environment or traumatized, the impact on the child, on the fetus, is that when that child, that fetus eventually is born as a baby, is that we know that they have fewer heart muscles. Been able to measure that. They have fewer kidney filtering units in their kidneys. The pancreas doesn't produce insulin appropriately, and insulin is critical for glucose, for your use of glucose. So what we do is we predispose people for diabetes, for hypertension, for cardiovascular problems. And one of the issues that was interesting that he talked about was that for the first time, we can say something we didn't know before with certainty. Over the last 25 or 30 years, there's been research done on the eating of processed foods. And the people who eat the most processed foods, unfortunately, are a younger generation. And we're seeing things turn up in younger people. And based on the statistics, on the projection, this is the first generation over the last 25, 30 years who have a lesser life expectancy than their parents. In the 1900s, there was 1 out of 100 people who was diabetic. 1960, there was 2. Right? By 1995, I think there was probably about 3 out of 100. 2005, it was like 8 out of 100. 250, I think 2015, we're looking at, maybe about that, about 1 to 5 out of 100 people, 1 out of 100 people, 3 out of 100, 3 out of 5. We're looking at, by 2026, 2050, 1 out of every 3 people being potentially diabetic or obese or having some chronic disorder as a result of this. I didn't include this in this, but I'll send over the information for you, Amy. There's a TED Talk video by Kent Thornburg that really does a good job. It's probably about 15 minutes long. That will, I think, give you a great idea about epigenetics. So our experiences are literally becoming our flesh. So yes, what someone does can impact you. The good thing about this is not a death sentence, right? You're not locked in. We know that changes in environment and treatment can also change what that does. What is memory? I talked a little bit about this. On a biological level, memory consists of ingrained patterns of neural activation called neural net profiles or templates or schemas. This is neuroception, is that your body learns and your body remembers, even if you don't consciously remember that. In trauma, when people can't remember what happened to them, the body still remembers what happens to them. That's why they still display some of the symptoms, though they may not consciously be connected to it. They've dissociated. Yeah. Have you ever had an accident, car accident, or seen one where everything slowed down or you didn't remember what happened exactly? You may remember parts of it. That's a process. Any questions? Okay. Anything? I want to talk a little bit about the Polyvagal System. I won't try to get too sciencey with this. In 1993, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Stephen Porges, after years of research looking at the vagus nerve, discovered some interesting things about its function in human beings. There are 3 different vagus nerves. There's an ancient vagus nerve. Right, in the polyvagal, I should say this, the vagus nerve innervates all of these major organs. That means it connects to the heart, liver, you can see intestines, the bladder, lungs, and kidneys. Okay, so that's what that does. Okay. The polyvagal system is broken down into 3 different systems. The first one being, okay, because that actually works. I can use it, okay. The first one being this one is the ventral vagal complex signaling system. We have what we call an emotional or social engagement system. Okay. Also, we have what you're most familiar with, and you probably heard, the fight or flight system. This is when people get startled or feel that they're being attacked or run away. And then we have a dorsal vagal system. This system I want to talk about just briefly, the ventral vagal, because this is important. If you accept the theory of evolution, which he's basing some of his stuff on, we're evolved from turtles. Okay, yeah, not lizards. And turtles, as part of their primary defense, what they had was this ancient vagus nerve system. And what it caused them to do when they were under attack or stress, you've seen this in lizards or turtles, is what do? They freeze. Yeah, they literally freeze. Their heart rate, everything just kind of shuts down. An example would be, for instance, you ever seen a cat catch a mouse? But they haven't killed the mouse yet. They've just caught the mouse. The mouse completely loses all muscle tone. It faints. Same reflex. It freezes. That reflex. We as human beings inherited that, and we have that same vagus system, and we carry that with us. But in part of our evolution, we developed a second one as well. Most mammals, all mammals, have what we call the sympathetic nervous system. And that sympathetic nervous system essentially is the one that lets us either defend or run away. That's the fight or flight system that most people are familiar with. Right? You see a bear in the woods, you get a rush of adrenaline, right, etc. Your amygdala says bear, run, or fight, so you do one or the other. When people are traumatized, when people are traumatized, that's typically the reaction that we associate with trauma, that we talk about trauma with, right? We talk about people being constantly in this kind of state of hypervigilance, right? They're tense physically, psychologically. There's a third system, and this is the dorsal vagal complex. This is that immobilization system. And this is a system where you've heard situations, we consider that might be the system involved in SIDS, sudden infant death system, or people who've just dropped dead exercising or doing things. They've been overstressed, their system, that nervous system. Yes, believe it or not, that's happened. That's also the system that I describe when you have a child who can't remember something, but yet they're having a physical reaction to it, like that, where they freeze. This is a system where we see people become very passive or they freeze in that particular system. Some effects of trauma, the social engagement system, that was the ventral system. Somebody come help me is typically the response. And that's an important system because when we developed that last system, the social engagement system, and this is hierarchical, the old system, fight or flight, then social engagement, is that we developed the ability from this part of our face up to become expressive. All right. Is this a smile? Do you recognize that as a smile? Is it a smile? Is that a smile? Why isn't it a smile? What's a smile? What we learn to do. Think about looking at a baby, right? What that social system, the vagus nerve, did as we evolved, it connects to several things. One, it allows us to use our striated muscles in the face, our orbital muscles. And we know a smile is when the eyes smile, right? And we're all smiling, right? We recognize it. You recognize that smile, right? When we look at a baby, what are we looking at? Babies look for that. When they look at it, they scan your face, and that's partially built in. The other part of that is that The vagus nerve also is connected to the muscle of our inner ear, innervates that. And when we are activated, when that vagus social system activates, then it allows us also to be able to tune into language, to listen to it. And when people are sometimes traumatized, right, and they're having a sympathetic reaction, they're not in that social system, they really can't process language. You've seen that, I'm sure. You've probably the great example is somebody just really screaming at a kid, and the kid is standing there frozen. They say, didn't I tell you 100 times? Right? And the kid is not even thinking. They can't even engage the prefrontal cortex. They're just literally in fight or flight mode. And if it gets bad enough, they'll be in that dorsal vagal, they'll be frozen, right? You'll see a kid who just, and you can tell when it's a frozen because what happens to the face, it just goes. Just blank with that. Nothing from here up. Also, that social vagus nerve connects to our larynx, pharynx, tone of voice, right? That's how it can trigger. If the association for trauma may be a low voice for someone, perpetrator had a low voice and they hear that low voice, that can trigger people and they have a physical reaction, not even remember it. But also, how do we talk to children? We raise our voice. Aren't you so cute? So good. Oh, look at you. Right? Doesn't everyone's voice go up? Men, women? Because that's the voice that allows the signals to the child at a very fundamental level that it's safe to be in the presence, to be in our presence. And so this part signals for us as human beings, either it's safe to approach and be close and be immobile, close to you, or I need to stay away. Does that make sense? Just kind of different, kind of an evolution. There's a hierarchy of those nerves. So when trauma happens, what happens is there's a collapse of that. The first thing that goes off is the social dominance or that social ability. So when people lose that, they can't be moral, they can't connect to the prefrontal cortex, they can't problem solve, they really can't hear what you're saying or understand it. What we know is that when people are traumatized, they typically only hear the first part of a word and they can't make out the last of it, it drops off. Okay, with that, a number of things. They become, right, they become really sometimes dissociated if it's bad enough, and they lose time, right? The hippocampus is impaired with that. Where did I set it down? I gave it something. Oh, here it is. I just want to share that. This is the dorsal vagal shift, frozen. I'll send this. That's what I just explained. These are some of the symptoms when someone is in that dorsal area where they are just literally just overwhelmed, close to fainting, or they're immobilized, freezing, speechless, dissociation, involuntary defecation or urination, etc. And I've seen people go through that. I've seen that in military. I've seen that in kids. This is one of the reasons why you hear therapists say that we don't want people to necessarily, until they're prepared, to access those memories that are traumatic. How do you keep people safe and provide treatment? This is what that is about, because sometimes if someone accesses that and they don't have skills in order to kind of ground themselves, that they don't have a way to be safe, they can be re-traumatized and made worse. There is a range for that, and I think you spoke of that. There's a range. We have a tolerance, right? Upper range of tolerance, and then we have a baseline. If we're in that range, most people are able to function within their range, and it's different for everyone. Some people may have less. With the epigenetics, if I've been born with some deficits and I don't tolerate stress too well, I get sick easy, my immune system has been depressed, then something that you may just kind of, that irritates me, but I'm, roll off your back, you just go on your way. That might hit me, I might have a completely different reaction. I might end up getting a cold, right? That kind of thing. I might become depressed. Once you go above that tolerance level, okay, it's kind of like blowing your stack. Your mind gets blown. Yes, go ahead. Hmm? Yes.
Why are siblings in their reactions with the
Yeah. With the epigenetics, you know something? Because epigenetics doesn't, like I said, it's not a death sentence, it's not life sentence. What you do impacts that, can change that. We know that children who, for instance, maybe a good example would be, for instance, children who were in the Bosnian Romanian War, who were in that war, there's been a lot of studies, but there was a study that looked at the kids who were in an orphanage, and the kids in that orphanage had shut down completely. They were in that dorsal vagal thing. They weren't laughing, they weren't talking, they didn't have eye contact, they didn't have facial expression about a lot of stuff other than they may cry. And that eventually went away for some of the kids because no one responded to them. Right? So these kids who basically, you would go into this orphanage and it'd be just completely silent. They would just be sitting either in the bed or in the corner, or you might find some kid banging their head or such thing. What they did, what they discovered and what they did, they came in and they said, we have to figure out how can we help these kids. And this is where a lot of the research for play therapy came from. As they said, kids are supposed to play. That's work for kids. That's the natural developmental, kids are to play, right? As adults, we forget that, but really that's important for adults too. If you don't play or have real leisure, you tend not to be a very happy camper. Okay, but what they did, they came in and they started just basically trying to play, and it took time. And for some of those kids, and for a lot of those kids, eventually after they were able to learn to play again, you would walk into that same place and you would hear a ruckus, just like on a playground, right? Kids are laughing, they're doing different things, that kind of stuff. That's important. What we know sometimes in families, you know, and there are different theories. There's a theory of sibling order, right? That kind of thing. But in terms of just simply expression, a lot of times what it has to do is who they find, how well they feel understood and nourished, okay, and how safe they feel. There's a difference between, and let me see if I can make this distinction. There's danger, real danger in the world, right? And people respond to that, and you should respond to that. But there's sometimes a perception of danger that isn't real. There's a threat for people. And there are some people who may perceive danger, but there's nothing objectively in the environment that really is dangerous. There's not a lion or tiger there. But I have developed a schema, a way of looking at the world that has put me into this state. And there could be a number of reasons for that. And we know this sometimes with families. We know that sometimes, right, think about this. And you hear this kind of as a joke, right? I started with my first kid. They were practice. Right? That's what we practice on, right? Everything was doing it. Second kid comes along. You see a commercial like this, right? Second kid comes along, right? You just throw them the Pampers, put it on. Take care of yourself, you know, that kind of thing. Whatever may be happening. So depending on those kind of relationships, and if a person is getting what they need met, part of that is emotionally. If I get hurt, do I get a response that's supportive, or do I get some other response that basically minimizes that or dismisses it? If I'm scared, do I get someone who comforts me? Or do I basically get one who says, you know, quit being, you know, a wuss? Buckle up. What happens? And then also to some degree, because you are siblings doesn't mean you have the exact same genetics. We've done study with twins, and we know that when there's a twin who may be predisposed to PTSD, that his twin is a little bit more susceptible than the average. Okay. The same thing with alcoholism and some of the other things that we've seen. So with that. But a lot of times it just has to do with the time where the parents are, their energy level. Right? If you have children and you're older, you don't have as much energy as a young parent. You know, you're not going to be running and doing things. If they're in a foster home and they've been shifted around to different foster homes, then there's a sense of feeling abandoned. You know, where do I really belong? You know, can I really relax and trust that this is home, I'm going to be here, or are you going to kick me out the moment I do something? That kind of thing. So there's a number of reasons. No one more simple, but this is a good question. There's a cascade of reasons for that. Let me go through. I want to talk a little bit, and this is what you were talking about. You talked about the dogs and mitigation and adaption. What we know with trauma is that once a person has exceeded their tolerance and they've sustained that, right? We call this toxic stress or chronic stress, and many people have this. And we see this in terms of the kind of illnesses, if your immune system gets depressed. Have you ever had a project or anything that just took you beyond the point of what you knew your particular tolerance was, and you were just tired, exhausted, right? If you're lucky, you can eventually get out from under that. But with trauma, that stress stays there. And sometimes it gets even bunched up. Reactive mitigation, right, range of tolerance. When we talk about mitigation from this perspective in trauma, we're talking about that dorsal response. And basically what we see are passive responses for people. People basically just become depressed, or else they just freeze, so to speak, symbolic. They become turtles. They go into a shell. The reactive adaption, the other side of that, the fight or flight, this is when we see kids, particularly in the classroom, this is where we see kids who start becoming destructive. They kick things, they run around, they won't sit. Most kids will do that. They'll talk back to the teachers. Mm-hmm.
That reactive mitigation, there's like that whole sort of like shutdown thing. Can that also be something like I can't?
Giving up?
So it's not so much like physically shutting down, just like I'm done. Giving up, just saying I'm not gonna deal with it. I'm gonna go do something else.
People can try that. They can do that. But what we know about trauma is that it's really a physical thing, and the body, it's bi-directional. The body goes through what it goes through, and it affects our mood with that. And certainly people can kind of think, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not motivated. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, trauma, where we know trauma impacts people is in their body. For the diagnosis of PTSD, essentially there's a category A and category Bs. It really is a category B that is really what cements the diagnosis, and that's all physical stuff we see in people. These are some of the things that you would see with people who are adapting or people who are in mitigation, who are being aggressive and passive. Angry, aggressive, defensive, reactive, impulsive, hostile, irritable. Both of these people are self-centered. In the passive, you see the freeze, paralysis of action. This freezing doesn't always happen physically. Many times you see people freeze in their thought, and they dissociate. I can't remember. What did you say? Etc. I'm not there. Emotional numbing, distraction, self-soothing, right? We see that. Of course, we think this is part of what triggers addictive processes, behavioral processes with people at times trying to self-soothe. Distancing. People try to get away from whatever is making them feel unpleasant. Big events are not required for trauma to take place. It really is what registers in your central nervous system, what the body remembers, what the body feels and knows. And that's outside of your conscious awareness again sometimes. Not always, but many times it is. And particularly for some of the events that aren't necessarily big events, but are just consistent. Many situations can be single activators, right? Someone threatens someone's life, response to the system, witnessing, experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, physical abuse and neglect, witnessing or being a victim of violent crime, military theater action, accidents, and bad injuries. Small repeated events have a cumulative effect. So if you had a child that was in, for instance, in school and they had really just terrible experiences with the teacher, they weren't treated very kindly, very nice, and you stick them into a room with a teacher who treats them the same way, they're going to be reactivated. They're going to continue to take on whatever is going to be bothersome for them. This is the low-intensity trauma. Remember, it's not the event. When we talk about trauma, sometimes people think about the event, but it really is your response to the event. Okay. I'm going to go past that one. I wanted to come to this one because this is how we think about it, how traditionally I've thought about trauma, right? And we understand that the nervous system learns from the environment. You stick your finger on a hot stove and you get burnt. You don't try to do it again. Our system becomes dysregulated. We lose the ability to think and be intentional and deliberate in how we live. We have difficulty learning. Trauma is a body reaction to sympathetic system dominance that has occurred continuously and repeatedly. And it changes our system. When we are under trauma frequently, what happens is our hypothalamus, it shrinks. Our hippocampus begins to lose some of its cells, and so we have difficulty remembering and learning. There's a word we use for it. We call it the hot system, just another way of talking about when you're activated. So, has anyone ever tried to, when you've been upset, explain something to you or want you to understand something? And then you realize after you have passed through that moment and you're on the other side of it, I don't know what they were saying. What were you talking about? You realize I have to go back and really I need you to really say that again. Explain what you meant. When I was angry, I couldn't hear you. I couldn't when I was triggered. So the hot system is really about being triggered in that fight or flight state. When someone has trauma, they go through a lot of this, and so language reduces, logic and reason shifts. When people have been traumatized, there's a lot of self-blame and self-loathing as well. More reasoning lessens or disappears. When they're in this reactive state, they're being defensive, hypervigilant. And when someone is being traumatically triggered, when we talk about triggers, they really can't be present with you. So they're not going to be able to really think morally or to problem solve. The medial prefrontal cortex gets dysregulated when trauma occurs, impacts memory and recall. This is where we talk about dissociation when people can't remember what happened to them. In the military, I was in Crete. We were doing operations, and several Marines got onto a helicopter to go back to the ship, and it lifted up, went up about 300 feet, and it dropped. Boom. Okay, with that. No one was killed, but there were severe injuries with that. Being a corpsman, a combat medic, my job was to attend to the people who were there, so I did that. Afterwards, when I talked to them, a few days, even weeks later, many of the people didn't remember what happened. They couldn't remember the event. They knew they were injured and they were hurt. When people are in that fight or flight mode, survival mode, they're not looking at the scenery. So if you have a child or someone who's traumatized and you're trying to explain something complex to them or something you think is important, they're probably not important for them. They're not going to be processing that or hearing that. No matter the reality of the view. Therapists get frustrated sometimes. They believe that they have a solution for a patient and they're really trying to get the patient to buy into it. The patient doesn't hear it. The other side of that is the parasympathetic executive functioning. This is when someone isn't in that fight or flight mode. They're able to access their executive function, bodily regulation and coordination of physiological responses. One of the skills that we teach, or multiple skills we teach, is what we call grounding skills. That's relaxation skills, the ability to kind of bring yourself out of a panic, to reduce your anxiety, to stay present in the moment. Attuned communications, people can hear and communicate with other people. Emotional balance and regulation. Flexibility and response. I can actually pause before reaction. In a trauma reaction, there is no thought, so I just react. This is where you see sometimes in situations where people may be talking to someone and they get triggered and immediately they go into an argument. You were attacking me. Why did you say that? I saw how you looked. All those can be that reaction. When we lose flexibility, when we have flexibility, we're able to kind of say that, say, oh, okay. You could say, oh, I wasn't looking, I just happened to be looking that way, thinking of something else. Fear modulation. Rest, relaxation, and reset response. I can do that. I don't have to stay in fear continuously. I could be empathetic when I have my executive functioning working correctly. There's insight, discernment, and judgment. I can actually think and problem solve. I have moral awareness. I'm not just self-centered. In trauma, if I'm scared, I'm just thinking about me and I'm not going to try to reach out to you. Okay. Intuition and spiritual feelings. I can connect to that. Identity. I have a sense of self. I don't feel dissociated. I know who I am as a person. I have a sense of value and self-worth. And this is just a contrast to when someone is triggered, that hot system. What trauma does is it puts people in the hot system. And what we try to do when we're working with people is to keep them out of that, is to move them over to the cool system. And that's what therapy is really trying to accomplish, is to get people from there to there, to help people develop those skills. Okay. Enough of me talking quickly. I went through that quickly because there's a lot in this slide that you don't have, and I'm just trying to hopefully rush through some of it. Any questions? Any questions? Okay. Any comments? Let me get out of that. Am I going back? Okay. Go ahead. Any comments? Okay. All right. That's what I was trying to rush to get to this, because I wanted you to just simply, if you want to try to experience something. We are, wow, that's 50. Take a break. Okay. Take 5 minutes, come back. I'm going to go through the rest of this, and I'll get you out of here hopefully a little bit early. Okay. Let you finish. I appreciate you. You sat for a long time, and I talked fast. You guys have done better than I did. I fall. You did well. I fall out after about 20, 30 minutes. Even when I'm interested. Oh, it's a long week for me. So.
When you're interested, you make it longer.
Yeah. A little bit. Yeah, we do. Yeah, actually, that's actually critical sometimes working with people who've been traumatized. Is you don't want to give them something complex, something that's real simple and easy to use. Breathing is one of the things that we teach many people when they're stressed. They begin to chest breathe, and what we try to do is to get them to breathe using the diaphragm. So just simple breathing. There's a 4-7-8 method, which is breathe. Did you? Yeah. It does well. Breathe in for 4, hold it for a count of 7, and then breathe out for 8. That's simple. I mean, and kids do it. We do that with adults. I use that as one of the first things to help get people grounded. Meditation works for some people if they're able to meditate briefly. The other one that we use is progressive muscle relaxation frequently. We just have people scan their body. Wherever you're feeling that tension, just relax, be in a comfortable position, and just let that go. Just breathe naturally and just get used to doing that, releasing that. And many people don't realize that they're holding themselves sometimes physically. Sometimes people feel like, oh, I have a tension in my abdomen, or I have a tension in the back of my neck, or my shoulders, they're hunched. Else I have my jaws clenched, or my tongue. Even though in the jaws, sometimes people are feeling that sense. So yeah, simple things like that. Those are some of the simplest ones. There's other ones. What they used to do for marksmen, for snipers in the military, so that they would relax and be able to focus as they would get their tongue and move it to the back of the soft palate. You have the hard palate, kind of here on top. You would go and put your tongue gently on the back of the soft palate. And what that does was to relax. It triggers, if you will, a vagal response that helps you to relax. It gets you out of a fight or flight. And so what it did is it studied their hand. They're able to breathe and study and boom. Yeah, shoot better with that. So.